Let's begin with prayer book, prayer for the church. Gracious Father, we pray for thy holy Catholic Church. Fill it with all truth, in all truth with all peace. Where it is corrupt, purify it. Where it is in error, direct it. Where in anything it is amiss, reform it. Where it is right, strengthen it. Where it is in want, provide for it. Where it is divided, reunite it. For the sake of Jesus Christ, your Son, our Savior. Amen. Well, so a delight to introduce Valerie. Many of you know her. She's been with us since like mid-2018, right, Valerie? Yeah, she's the chaplain for Williams College, and just a wonderful leader also at our church in Williamstown, St. John's. She was raised in the African-American Pentecostal tradition. She joined the Episcopal Church as a young adult. She has a BA from Penn State and an MDiv from Union Theological Seminary. Valerie holds a doctorate in Anglican Studies and U.S. Episcopal History from General Theological Seminary. Since July of 2018, as I said, she served as chaplain in our own Williams College in Williamstown. Welcome, Valerie. Glad you're here.
Glad to be here. So how do we do introductions? Does everyone know everybody? No? So I'm Valerie, and I will be talking about the 20th century and the Episcopal Church, which is tricky because my advisor said the Episcopal Church has not yet had its finest hour, but I would say that the 20th century might be one of those centuries that the Episcopal Church might be proud of. Didn't start off very well, ended on an interesting note, and a lot of adventure, spiritual adventures in between. So why don't we just quickly say our names and pronouns, if you wish, and where you are serving. And I'm going to call on somebody, and then that person should call on someone, because our squares are in different orders. So I'm going to call on Nancy.
There we go. I'm Nancy Sage. I am at Church of the Reconciliation in Webster, the new senior warden. I took over for Mark Rogers. And that's about it, I guess.
Now you call in someone.
Let's see. How about Susan?
Okay. Yeah, hi.
Oh, there's two.
Oh, which other Susans? I'll go first. Or you want to go? Why don't you go ahead, Susan?
It doesn't matter. I'm Susan Bastardo. I'm the new senior warden at St. Francis Holden. And I'll call on Susan Albin.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Susan Albin. I'm the canon for administration on diocesan staff. Oh, and let's see, Lee.
I'm Lee Mullins, and I'm co-senior warden at All Saints Berkshires in North Adams. And I'll call on Mary Frances.
And I'm Mary Frances Kearns, and I serve the wonderful people at All Saints Berkshires, North Adams. And I call on St. Philip.
I'm not St. Philip. I'm Michael Bullock. I'm the priest in charge at St. Philip's, East Hampton. And as I have done in previous meetings, I'm going to call on our canon for communications.
That would be me, Vicki Ix, and I'm also vicar at St. John's in Ashfield. I'm going to call on Jane Griesbach.
Thank you. I'm Jane Griesbach, I'm a deacon serving at St. Francis Church in Holden. And we have the best senior warden ever. And I'll call on Linda Topier.
I am Linda Topier. I'm the deacon at Christ Church Cathedral. I call on, I don't know who hasn't gone. Sam?
I'm Sam Smith. I'm the rector at All Saints Church in Worcester. I'll call on Michael.
Michael Tuck. I serve as priest in charge at St. Helena's Chapel and also rector of Trinity Church, both in Lenox. I think that's it, isn't it?
You didn't call on the bishop.
Your
Bishop.
Grace.
I'm Doug. I serve wherever my executive assistant, Lainey Herbert, tells me to go. And I'm really looking forward to this. I love history. I was a history major in college. So welcome, Valerie.
Okay, thank you. And I am really excited to be here. And so what we're going to start with is a quick review. And this is a visual review. So I am going to put up a timeline. And one of the major things I really want us to think through as we are talking about the Episcopal Church in the 20th century is what I've been hearing a lot, which is nothing's ever going to change. Right? You've heard that nothing's ever going to change. So if anything, as we do a quick review, and I mean like really quick review, you will see that things did change. So bear with me as I share my screen. Let's see. All right. So this really is just a review. And so I'm going to talk very quickly, but if you have questions, so you know that North America had once been a colony of the British Empire, and the churches that were Anglican were connected with the Church of England. And after the American Revolution, the churches reorganized and became the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States. Everyone knows that? That's the starting point. I wanted to show how the diocese kind of just sprung into being. I'm still annoyed that Delaware is the first state. I'm a Pennsylvanian, but as you see, the Diocese of Pennsylvania was before Delaware, so that's a small thing. But it happened really fast. All of the colonies just quickly organized their Anglican churches into dioceses, and as the country grew, dioceses came online. At the bottom of most of these charts are just people who were key players in the shaping of the Episcopal Church. And what I like looking at is who were contemporaries, who were in the room at the same time. I want to just point out John Henry Hobart. He was the first bishop who was not born in the colonies. All the first 10 bishops were all part of the Church of England. John Henry Hobart was not. And in an interesting way, John Henry Hobart put into place a lot of changes that led to what the church is today. So this is a quick review. If you notice on the next slide, you see a lot more dioceses coming into play. And if you notice how there's not necessarily a correspondence between when the diocese comes online and when the state comes online. So still by the mid-19th century, there were still dioceses that were forming, but some major changes were coming to play, which I want to point out because this does affect the 20th century. If you notice, in 1835, there was a major reorganization of the church. And by the way, everyone, The church reorganized several times, including at the beginning of the 20th century. But a major reorganization happened in 1835, primarily to absorb these new dioceses. I want to point out Philander Chase at the bottom. So how do you, I would like a bit of Q&A. How do you, in the 19th century, how do you form a diocese? Think about what's happening. It's the Second Great Awakening. So the Episcopal Church was not necessarily involved with the Second Great Awakening. So most people are going to churches that are more exuberant worship. And it's also that awkward period leading up to the Civil War. And so slavery is a major issue and very divisive. You've got Andrew Jackson, who is the president. And he was definitely pro-slavery and although pro-common man too. So how do you form a diocese? No idea? Just no? Yeah? Okay. Yes, Father Michael, please.
Send a missionary bishop?
That is a very good answer, but that is not what Philander Chase, what happened with Ohio. Actually, basically a group of lay people got into a room with a couple of priests and they declared themselves in that living room the Diocese of Ohio. And so that didn't go over very well. That happened in 1823. And so the Episcopal Church had no way of actually establishing dioceses. Like if you were clever enough and you had a living room, a couple of priests and lay people, boom, there you have it. And so it was in 1835, as part of the reorganization, that they did begin to establish missionary bishops. And so Father Michael is right. It's just that a couple of rugged individualists took it into their own hands. So, and one of the things why I'm going through this review is I want to look at the ways that the church has changed as we are trying to figure out what are we going to do. And I will tell you, almost always, it was a creative idea. Okay, so so the 19th century is struggling not only with slavery. This is in 1838. You see, the Native Americans are being forced off their land, and that is also happened in the Northeast. But this is all leading up to the Civil War. We have people beginning to be interested in missionary work, and you begin to have the deaconess movement started in 1836 in Germany, but spread to the United States and is part of reaching out to African Americans, Native Americans, and people who are experiencing poverty. People organize, sometimes as deaconesses, sometimes lay people work together to provide social support. So that leads all the way up to the Civil War. So I'm just really pushing through this. You can see some of the people who are involved with shaping where the church is going, but you see the world is changing too. 1848 is the first wave of the women's movement. You have the Underground Railroad is fully in full gear. The potato famine is happening in the mid and 19th century and leading up to the Civil War. So after the Civil War, the church, and this is actually now where we talk about the 20th century, because the church had always been doing some kind of social work while at the same time arguing over slavery. So you have people arguing over slavery, owning slaves, and then trying to provide education and support for slaves and Native Americans. The Episcopal Church being a big tent, it can be confusing because all of those forces were within the church, depending on dioceses and location. It's just during this time, women began to really organize, and 1871, the Women's Auxiliary was formed. It is actually women's. And and starting after and during Reconstruction, Blacks were involved in predominantly white churches, but they were resisting Black leadership and Black churches basically being autonomous. Okay, so now this brings us to the 20th century. So do we have any questions before we go into the 20th century? So before we go into the 20th century, I want to just show you what our themes are going to be. You see this, right? We're going to look at the Episcopal Church in the Gilded Age. Does anyone know what the Gilded Age is? Yes. Yes, Father Michael.
Time of great economic wealth inequality with a lot of white dudes who from New York who had houses in Lenox.
Yes, and in fact, the Episcopal Church's role in the Gilded Age is it tended to be the church where a lot of the industrial giants went to church. Okay, so we are going to look at the Episcopal Church in the Gilded Age, and then we're going to leap to the 1950s. We are going to talk about what happened between 1906 and 1950, but that will be another quick review. But we're going to look at the Episcopal Church and the liturgical movement in the 1950s. How many of you are familiar with the liturgical movement? Somewhat. So, and I'm not surprised, but if you are not, but it is actually something that's very important to who we are today. Then we are going to look at the Episcopal Church and equality, how the Episcopal Church, as the nation was changing, how was it dealing with its own segregated church, and the rise of activists in the Episcopal Church. And then finally, we're going to look at the Episcopal Church of full inclusion, how the Episcopal Church learned from some of the things it did in the 19th and 20th, early 20th century, how it began to understand the difference between equality, which was almost always separate but equal, and full inclusion in the life of the church. These, I think, are the major themes of the 20th century. There are a lot of things that happened in the 20th century, so bear with me. I'm really going to only look at these 5 things, these 4 things. And I do believe that these 4 things hold the key to where we're going in the next 100 years. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing. All right. The Episcopal Church in the Gilded Age, first of all, the robber barons, sometimes they're called, they were good churchmen. And in fact, probably one of the most famous Episcopalians was J.P. Morgan, who attended Calvary or St. George in Manhattan. They still tell stories about Mr. Morgan, because if he didn't like a hymn, he made like annoying sounds during the hymn. And if he liked the hymn, then he sung along. And it is my understanding he did not have a good voice. So it was probably better if he didn't like the hymns. Andrew Carnegie was a Presbyterian, but Andrew Carnegie was one of the few robber barons that really made a connection between his faith and his moral obligation to people. And the Baptist John Rockefeller, who was a good churchman and had a strong hold on the oil industry. So the backdrop of going into the 20th century was the Episcopal Church was a really wealthy church. And it tended to be in the urban areas. You would have, most of the parishes were wealthy, and then they would often have a parish that was where their workers would go. And so that's the Episcopal Church at the beginning of the 20th century. Remember those specialized ministries we looked at in the 19th century? Those were, many of those ministries were funded through the efforts of the Women's Auxiliary, who, we know those mic boxes, their idea. And so, and the United Thank Offering, their idea. And in many ways, the Women's Auxiliary, although a marginalized group of people, but married to a lot of the robber barons. And so they were phenomenal with raising money for these, for ministry efforts. However, starting in 1880, the Episcopal Church decided to try a new innovation where instead of just a unified approach to just helping anybody that they could, they created specialized ministries for Blacks, Native Americans, immigrants, people in Appalachia. Now, that sounds like a good idea, but the problem was it actually played into the segregation that was part of the country. So the Episcopal Church would create the Freedmen's Bureau to help Blacks after the Civil War, but the same Freedmen's Bureau might be used to kind of keep Blacks segregated. You had Episcopal parishes and ministries reaching out to Native Americans, and this happened in Western Massachusetts in our diocese, where Hobart assigned someone to help minister to the Stockbridge Muncie band. And that same person, somehow the government convinced them, the so-called missionary, to encourage the people to go west. Basically, they were gently pushed off their lands. And so, so there is this weird combination at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century where missionary work was twisted and used for segregation and subjugation. The effects of this were significant. Before the Civil War, or right after the Civil War, African Americans had been part of white congregations, although new Black congregations were evolving. And then in 1881, like for instance, in 1881, there were 89 Black members across 31 predominantly white parishes, while there was like 609 Blacks and 22 Native Americans in non-white parishes. In 1903, for a small diocese, Southern Virginia to be specific, 46 African Americans were scattered over 13 predominantly white parishes. But by 1929, 572 Black communicants were all in Black parishes. So that's how things began in the 20th century. No surprise, W.E.B. Du Bois said that the 20th century, the real issue that will drive the 20th century is going to be what? Does everyone remember this famous quote? Shout it out. The color line. Basically, at the very beginning of the 20th century, people realized that this is going to be a major issue and continues to be so today. Women were also losing ground. So the 19th century was a very good time for women. 1848, Seneca Falls, the beginning of the women's movement. And you had a lot of women going and taking care of the sick, teaching schools. It was an era of women empowerment. That led to the Women's Auxiliary, and also in 1889, the church finally recognized deaconesses. But going into the 20th century and leading up to women's suffrage, women really lost ground. So the beginning of the 20th century, women had a lot of power, particularly in the West. So when the new churches were formed, they were the ones who were the engines behind parish life. So what we know of parish life today, which is that celebrations, the fundraisers, the fairs, right? In the West, churches were the only social thing that was happening. And so it has been described at the turn of the century that women really held the power of the church, and the men held token positions on vestries. And with all of that fundraising power of the Women's Auxiliary, women really had a lot of power at the beginning of the 20th century, but they lost ground. They lost ground. In 1919, General Convention rejected a resolution from the Diocese of Maine to grant women full rights and privileges. The Women's Auxiliary, which had become a powerful fundraising arm of the Board of Missions, was reorganized in the 1919 reorganization of the church, and they became an auxiliary to the newly established position of the presiding bishop and to National Council. But they were not allowed to serve on National Council until 1934. At General Convention in 1925 and 1928, they rejected resolutions from the deaconesses for an office of ordination for the 1928 prayer book. The deaconess community was on the decline as well, even though they were fully recognized in 1889. By 1922, their numbers had shrunk significantly. And younger women of the 1920s went into other professions, helping services than ministry. The social ministries of the church suffered from these setbacks, giving and combined with the 1929 depression. And so giving dropped from 44 million in 1927 to 30 million in 1934. All right. So, by the way, the Gilded Age is full of weak presidents and industry titans, and it also had a very turbulent economy. So the Episcopal Church still remained a rather wealthy church in fact, one of the presidents used to summer up here, Chester Arthur, he at Lenox, and also Garfield In fact, let me see. I'm sharing the screen just to show you. In fact, see up here, James Garfield was a Williams alum, and in fact, his assassination attempt occurred when he was on his way to his reunion. So I hear that every year. Every year, an alumni says, you know, James Garfield was killed on his way to this meeting. And he was replaced by Chester Arthur, who has a stained glass window in Trinity Linux. Other weak presidents was Grover Cleveland. Not only was he weak once, he was weak twice. And and don't even get me started on Rutherford B. Hayes. He was the one who ended Reconstruction and restored the Black codes that became the Jim Crow laws that remained in place until the mid-20th century. So the robber barons were much stronger than the presidents. Okay. Any questions? Any questions thus far? I can't see your hands because of the way the screen goes. Can you go ahead and just start talking if you have a question?
Actually, this isn't a question. It's a great presentation you're making. I love it. But just in connection with J.P. Morgan is that I served at West Point and the church right outside West Point, Holy Innocents in Highland Falls. And just like all the presidents who came to Lenox, J.P. Morgan had a summer home in Highland Falls. And he was a prominent member of Holy Innocents Church. There's plaques to him. And he built the rectory, which is literally a mansion. This rectory is like a mansion. But the legendary story that's told about him is that he had a pew, that he always sat in. And there was a farmer who was about 10 miles away who would get to church before him and sit in that pew. And so then J.P. Morgan, they would literally clear out the street. So his carriage come down the street and come to church. He would try and get there earlier than that guy. And so eventually J.P. Morgan was getting to the 10 o'clock service at 9 o'clock so he could beat this farmer to his pew.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. How many of you knew this J.P. Morgan connection with the Episcopal Church?
Well, he started the pension fund of blessed memory. Some of us are grateful for that.
Yep. I will retire on J.P. Morgan money. There's so much more to be told about J.P. Morgan, but we're going to move forward. So I am intentionally jumping all the way to the liturgical movement, but I do want to give you an idea of what was going on in society. And I'm just going to give you. So before we talk about the liturgical movement actually started in 1910. And it started among the Roman Catholic Church, and then it spread to Holland, Italy, and England, and eventually in the 1950s to the United States. So when I'm talking about the liturgical movement, it was something that started actually in 1910. If you look at this chart, also in 1910 started the modernist fundamentalist collision in seminaries particularly. So there was a big fight over how do you process the Bible when science is actually discrediting some of the things that people held dear, like 7-day creation or the virgin birth. And so what defined liberals was a willingness to try to adapt to science, and what defined conservatives was a rejection of science and an effort to say that the Bible, you must take the Bible literally or you're a heretic. So there, I think these things are connected in terms of the liturgical movement that came about in the 1950s, and our present church is kind of divided over how do we process modernity, and included in that is how do we process this evolving multiculturalism. So that's kind of some backstory to the liturgical movement. So I'm going to skip over World War II. It happened. And I'm going to go to the post-war era, where American society really significantly changed. So that, and when you think about the early 20th century, the robber barons, the segregation, women's roles being curtailed, that continued until after World War II. And then after World War II, women were re-empowered during the war period because many of them held jobs and were able to take courses and be in degree programs because men were not there. And there was an effort to kind of encourage women to go back into the home after World War II. And that's where a lot of the social pressure of the social norms of the 1950s. During that period, Eisenhower was a very influential president, and he really, he was a person of faith, as was his brother, John Eisenhower, president of Penn State University. And actually those two together helped raise the prominence of especially the mainline denominations, of which the Episcopal Church is one. So I would say that broad stroke wise, nothing changed in the Episcopal Church from 1910 to 1928, when they were trying to bring about some changes, but all they got was the prayer book. And people lost ground, and then things were different depending on what diocese you were in or what part of the country you were in. But in the 1950s, they came out of the war, and that the Depression and the war really gave people an opportunity to think about their faith. And that made the Episcopal Church ready to receive that liturgical movement that started in 1910. There's two things about the liturgical movement. One, a man named Arthur Hebert wrote a book called Liturgy and Society. Now remember, everyone is ripped apart over the modernist fundamentalist split. Hebert said, let's look for meaning in our faith through the liturgy. And that would be a way of avoiding the confusion that has been left behind by the modernist fundamentalist arguments. And then another person named Dome Gregory Dix, who wrote a really important book called The Shape of the Liturgy. And he and many other scholars were researching new findings because they had uncovered a new collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think that's what it is. And they found new copies of liturgies, and it showed that those early celebrations from the 1st and 2nd century were built around these four actions: taking, blessing, breaking, and giving of bread and wine. And no surprise, this is about the time when scholars within the Episcopal Church began to call for a new prayer book. And some of you may remember the development of the prayer book took decades, and it was very much a response to the liturgical movement. Okay, so that is the liturgical movement. Any questions?
Just make an observation, if there's a moment, that to go back to the 1928 prayer book, in that period that you're talking about, the movement, as I understand it, was largely to not only just break away from England's 1662 prayer book, but to have a more of an American expression. And that was shut down. So we got the 1928 prayer book, which was just slightly Americanized. And I had a conversation with my mother when she was alive. In 1938, she was a junior in high school, and her chemistry book said that the atom was indivisible. And my point would be, well, in 7 more years from that point, talk about change, the explosion of the atomic bomb. So we were really in a time of looking backwards, and yet the realities were pushing us forward. And I would say that's what World War II represents, that we weren't ready. And we were forced into this new life where the atom was splittable.
So thank you for saying that. It's and once again, you see how change happens, even though slowly. And about the 28 prayer book, the Episcopal Church of the early 20th century was very enamored with England. They were very much Anglophiles, and so to separate further from England through liturgy, they were very resistant to that. Yes. So now that there's 2 more topics I want to talk about before we go to discussion, but one is about equality. In the Episcopal Church, so we talked about how it really went from the ministries of the 19th century to the segregated ministries of the early 20th century. And let me show you something on the slide. Let's see if I can. Okay, I'm going to share the screen real quick. If you see what's happening in American society in the 1950s, you see we're coming out of the World War II and going into the Cold War, which probably increased our belief in science, or more comfort in it at the very least. And then you see the beginnings of the civil rights movement. But as the country was dealing with, or it kind of maybe it might be called the first reckoning with the segregation of African Americans, you see in the church in 1947, Upper South Carolina, Georgia, and Arkansas, for the first time in the 20th century, admits Black parishes into their councils or conventions. Up until this time, especially from the beginning of the 20th century, Blacks were excluded from diocesan conventions and definitely the National Convention. In 1947, you also have Bishop Sherrill was appointed to Truman's Committee on Civil Rights. And one of the most important things that happened was the military was desegregated by an executive order in 1948. So you see that just as things are happening in the world, and in American society, the churches are asking questions. And so in 1951, the Episcopal Church began to desegregate its seminaries. And in 1955, the Episcopal Church began to address segregated church facilities. Now, here's a weird, funny story where they were opposed to having General Convention in Houston, because Houston was going to have segregated church facilities. And so they moved General Convention from Houston to Honolulu. So that was their solution. So not a good solution, by the way, people, because it's hard to get to Honolulu. However, the Episcopal Church kept moving forward, and in 1960s began to desegregate congregations, schools, and camps. The first Black student in an Episcopal school was in 1961. The first adult to attend a conference at a camp in Alabama, 1963. Martin Luther King's son applied for admissions to an Episcopal school in Atlanta and was rejected in 1963. But Bishop Randolph Claiborne forbid Episcopal clergy to work at the school, and the headmaster resigned. The first African-American bishop to exercise jurisdiction over European Americans, meaning not just a suffragette working for Blacks, but someone who was exercising jurisdiction over European Americans, was John Burgess in 1962. Bishop of where? Yes, Father Michael.
Massachusetts.
That's right. Very good.
I actually had a parishioner who went to a Sunday school teacher training with him, and she said he was amazing when he was archdeacon.
Wow. All
He
right.
confirmed me.
Whoa. Living history.
Yeah.
Woohoo. All right. So I'm gonna close with this, where we went from separate but equal to, and amazing things happened with women at this time. Like, women finally were allowed to serve in General Convention. They finally were allowed, women and men deacons were viewed as equals in 1970, and then but after many attempts at resolutions to allow women to become priests, 11 women were consecrated by 4 bishops in an irregular ordination in 1974. Then we got a new prayer book. Women were allowed to become priests, and they had the ordination liturgy for deacons in the prayer book. And it's a very American prayer book. So, but one of the things that really came about, especially in the 1994, well, actually in the 80s, the AIDS crisis really raised the awareness and about how LGBTQ people were being treated and mistreated by the church. So many Episcopal parishes, lay people and clergy worked towards supporting LGBTQ people during this crisis. It opened the door for a conversation about sexuality. In 1994, at General Convention calls for serious conversation with the Anglican Communion. Conversations continued in 1997. But by that time, gay clergy were serving in many churches without restrictions. And in 1997, the Episcopal Church didn't take any formal action, but for the most part, it was in some dioceses, LGBTQ people were accepted, but still another kind of separate but equal was evolving. Many LGBTQ people in the church basically demanded full inclusion, where there would be no part of the church that was excluded from anyone. And this full inclusion concept is unique. It's really unique. Other churches and religious communities are watching how we live this out. And that watching became more acute in 2003 when the Diocese of New Hampshire elected a partnered gay man as their bishop. And the Anglican Communion kind of went nuts. And so the debates over the Anglican Communion still continue. Sometimes it's over doctrine and what does the Bible say, but actually a man named Paul Avis wrote a book called The Identity of Anglicanism. And he said that it's really possible that the way forward is, in terms of unity, is not so much all of the arguments that ripped us apart at the beginning of the 20th century, but to talk about how do we do church? How do we serve others as part of the body of Christ? How do we practice our spiritual practices through liturgy, through prayer? So he's calling for a shift from the theological wranglings to discussions about how do we do church. And so That is the 20th century, which started in 1880 and ended in 2003.